Now to introduce today's host. Amanda Gluibizzi is an art scene editor at the Brooklyn Rail. She's an art historian and the co-director of the New Foundation for Art History and the author of Art and Design in the 1960s New York, which is forthcoming. She hosted an excellent conversation a couple weeks ago, which you can find on our YouTube, and so we are in very good hands today. Amanda, I'll turn it over to you now to introduce our guests.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you all for participating in this number 46 of the New Social Environment from the Brooklyn Rail. Today we're so lucky to have both Anne Hamilton and Michael Mercil with us. Anne Hamilton was born in Lima, Ohio, and she received her BFA from the University of Kansas and her MFA from Yale. Among her honors, Anne has been the recipient of a MacArthur Grant and a Guggenheim Fellowship, and she has also represented the United States at the Venice Biennale in 1999. Michael Mercil was born in Crookston, Minnesota, and received his BFA from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design and his MFA from the University of Chicago. He has held a Wexner Center for the Arts Film and Video residency and has received a National Endowment for the Arts Artist Design Fellowship. Since 2001, they have both taught in the MFA program at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, which is where I got to know them. And I just want to say right at the offset that they are lovely and were the very first people to invite me over for dinner when I moved to Columbus and didn't know anyone. So as you can imagine, being invited to totally famous artist's house for dinner, not at all nerve-wracking. So let's get started. Anne, recently you wrote about the isolation of this period in a piece that you shared with me that you had written for Columbia University. And you ended the first paragraph by saying, "The view out my window is the same, but what I see is different," which I thought was really lovely. And so I want to ask you and Michael about this. How has this strange time affected your work in the studio? And has anything changed about your practices?
So, Michael, should I jump in?
Yes, you go first.
Okay. I think, in many ways, it's like that thing, everything is different and everything is the same. And so the practice kind of goes forward with the same questions behind it, which is always this challenge of how do you pay attention to what is drawing your attention? And that's the same no matter what period of time or place we find ourselves in. And so I think right now we're all listening very carefully. I think there's a lot of pressure to react or to respond or to have some big idea, but they don't happen like that. And so I think there's this moment now of trying to find the question and how to ask the question for this moment. And the only way I know how to do that is to try to pay attention to where it goes. So.
Yeah, and I would
Michael,
say
what
that,
about you?
for me, there's an interesting tension between what Anne describes as a kind of quietness and listening and a kind of noise. And certainly there's a lot of political noise that I eventually forced myself to turn off more or less, at least when I was in my studio. We are lucky in that we have studios that are accessible to us from home, so we don't always or typically work from home. And I would say as time has gone on, there is a sense of isolation in that what I'm a bit of an extrovert, and I've just been thinking of in the past couple of days of how to arrange some studio visits with friends. And how do we actually make that exchange possible? Because it's getting to be time where I'm in a thicket of questions that are visible questions rather than audible questions, and I'd like to begin to share them.
Oh, that's really interesting. What have you decided?
Well, I think what I could do is invite them. We have two separate buildings actually, and invite someone to my studio building to spend some time while I'm not here, and let them in, and then do the same with them, because the particular person I'm thinking of has a studio in their garage. And then hopefully we could do one of these strange Zoom space meetings and then just talk to each other about what we saw and what we thought we saw. And so it would be a little bit jarring because we wouldn't be in actual space, but at least we would have the memory of what those spaces are.
Both of you teach at Ohio State, and of course, colleges all over the world, but particularly in the United States, had to move to online classes only for the second half of the spring semester, which meant that you were doing MFA critiques, I assume via Zoom. How was that?
I actually thought it went remarkably well.
Oh, good.
But I also think it's because we had the advantage of knowing everyone and having been in their studios and having that kind of felt tactile presence of the work. So I actually thought we had some great and very productive conversations. But as we look forward to fall, I really don't know what replaces being able to respond to live presence. Like so many studio visits, there's the thing the person might put in front of you, but it's the thing over in the corner that is brought forward into conversation that shapes it. And how do you create that on the screen? So we'll see in the fall.
Yeah, that maybe leads a little bit to thinking from spring into, because we weren't, we teach a seminar together, as you know, and that seminar typically meets in our studio. And then there's a large portion of it that is critiques of student work, not necessarily in their studios, but on campus and not in our studio. And we really have started to rethink of, and that's been part of our whole philosophy of practicing, is opening up our studios so our students can actually see where and how we work. And that won't be possible, or it may not be possible in the fall. We're trying to figure out, and if not, how do we still keep that same atmosphere of availability, and kind of opening that curtain so that people can see who is or is not behind it.
Right.
So just, Amanda, just to demonstrate, I'm just going to turn my computer so you can see this is where the class usually gathers. And we have dinner. We have visiting artists, and we host all the graduate students and faculty for dinner, where another kind of conversation can happen that can't maybe happen so easily in an institutional space. And so we're hoping we can fill these tables. We'll see.
That's actually the perfect segue to the next question that I wanted to ask of you. Obviously, you both have individual art practices, but you also collaborate on something that you call the Living Culture Initiative. And the Living Culture Initiative is something that actually helps sponsor these visiting artists, or also visiting art historians, visiting philosophers, visiting filmmakers, to come to this space and have dinner with faculty members, community members, graduate students. I've even seen some undergraduate students there on occasion. It's something that's actually very, very similar, I think, to what we're trying to do now. And it's the thing that I thought of immediately when the Brooklyn Rail launched this new social environment. It's the city's most exclusive party, but everybody's invited, which is a really, really wonderful thing, right? And so how do you see Living Culture Initiative moving forward? What will happen with that, do you think?
Michael, that one's for you.
Okay. Well, I do think one of the challenges of virtual space, and actually this is I think you guys are doing a great job of providing a model for how people can engage virtual space, not as a secondary environment, but as a primary experiential environment. And that obviously it's structured and conditioned differently than actual space. A wonderful example from a week or two ago that I paid attention to, because I will admit, I have a hard time, because we teach, spending so much time on Zoom and in this space. I generally don't come back to it during my downtime for either entertainment or education. But I made an exception for a bit with a Bang on a Can festival that was a couple weeks ago. And that was structured with the founding members, you know, in this space, conversing with composers when there was a composer that had been commissioned to do a piece, and then the musicians playing. And there was something very kind of casual and conversational about it, and very open about it, and seeing people in their rooms, and it not being perfectly produced. And suddenly there was a kind of availability of an intimacy that would not be possible, you know, in a live performance. That was an interesting juxtaposition and an interesting way to me of thinking, okay, how do we make this a primary source of engagement rather than a secondary sort of, this is the best we can do. Mm-hmm. I think it'll take a bit of time and maturity, you know, but I think this is what we're learning right now. You know, we're on the ground in this learning mode right now, and becoming, it feels like, a bit more sophisticated every week, if not also a little bit more exhausted. So I keep hoping there will be some balance between the actual physical and then this virtual, because this virtual world does open itself up to a much larger, more diverse audience in a very immediate way. And I realize, you know, even, you know, when we talk about diversity, there is this, I don't know, a clink of, you know, not everyone has access to a computer. But hopefully once public libraries are up and running again, more people that don't have immediate access will be able to gain access, at least through that venue. Mm-hmm. So the public part of the Living Culture Initiative and any kind of social engagement, I think, is still a challenge, because as we know, in this country, public infrastructure tends to be weak rather than strong. So it's part of the political program, I guess, we all have to keep working on.
True, true.
Just to jump in, Amanda, too, I think that, like, one of the questions that haunts so much of the work as I go to make it is this question about how does the work make a condition for people to be together? Mm-hmm. And in some ways to be alone together. And I think that was a pretty big question for me when I was, for example, working on the project for the Armory.
Yes, that's the event,
you know, huge.
The event of a thread, Emily, just in case, if you want to try to pull that up for us. Sorry, Anne.
And, well, and just thinking about what is the nature of civic space now. At that time, obviously, you know, 6 years ago, it was a very different moment, but I was thinking about how could a project actually contribute to making the conditions within which people could be together, and the swings and, you know, everything did that. I think this isn't the right piece on screen.
That's
yeah, that's
a piece of Michael's. It's the video. It's called The Event of a Thread, I think.
Yeah, it's probably a little further up, Emily. There you go. Good.
Thanks, Emily. Anyway, and I think now, so it's like, I'm not primarily a screen-based person. So the question is, how, with the conditions and circumstances we have, how do we also ask that same question? And the video that I just put up on my website actually was a collaboration with the jazz guitarist, musician Bill Frisell. And it was, at this moment, we had made a book, or I had made a book that was meant to be given away as part of events at the university in the spring that didn't happen. And so my immediate response was like, well, how do I share this thing? So the impulse is to share it. And this video should probably run as a video that I'm seeing on the screen. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, is there a way to play it? There we go.
And you know, now the conversation's moved on to a different video, but that's okay. but it was like, what are our conditions if our, you know, our impulse is to reach out, our impulse is to share, to extend our hand, then how do we do that now? And the screen is the first place at the moment. Yeah.
That actually is another perfect move into one of the questions that I wanted to ask both of you before I turn to your individual practices, which is, what about collaboration? Both of you work so heavily with other artists and people who have expertise in different fields. And so when do you feel you're collaborating as opposed to when do you feel that you're the director of a project?
Maybe, Michael, you should talk about the project with Teague.
Yeah. Well, for me, it really depends on the nature of the piece. When I did which we can talk about later, a vaguely musical piece with a young percussion ensemble from Brooklyn named Teague, who I met initially as undergraduate students here at OSU. And they've stuck together, and now they're a professional ensemble. And I was commissioned to do a piece at the De Cordova Museum on Henry David Thoreau, and we worked together on a project called Thoreau's Desk. And that was one of those things where it was specifically written with them as performers in mind. And we've performed it. It's a complicated piece. It ends up with an object, and the sound is the sound, the music is the sound of making that object. So it's also related to John Cage's relationship with Henry Thoreau. But it really came to fruition through my relationship and by working with them. So what's on screen now is just a little video I made. I call these takes, silent takes. There's no sound to this. You provide the sound yourself, but it shows you, it highlights the object as a silent recording. And so really how this piece works is the crate, which you saw at the beginning, is opened up. It's full of tools. The score is for them to open up the crate, unpack the tools, cut the crate into pieces, paint it. And when and there's a dialogue that's spoken by two vocalists, and it's really the dialogue is based on John Cage interview speaking about Henry David Thoreau and his influence on Cage's attitude, where every sound is music now is a quote from Thoreau's journal. So it's really been working closely with them. This piece wouldn't have been possible. And every time we perform it, we have to make a new piece. So that's what this is. This is just a visual recording of those individual pieces that are now taken apart and in kind of wooden cassette crates. And so each object is one take of this performance. Other times, though, there are the kinds of collaboration is less up front and center stage. You know, a lot of times the collaboration is really behind the scenes and not so visible. This is an interesting one because actually the ensemble is in front of the scene whenever this is done, and I'm behind. I'm in the background and they're in the foreground. Whereas many other times, you know, it's inevitable that the artist whose name is on the project is somehow in the foreground.
Yes.
I think too, there's a difference between collaboration and conversation. And like in some ways, there are those formal collaborations. In my case, it would be a collaboration often with like working with the director, theater director, and Bogart and City Company. Mm-hmm. They read to the pigeons at the Armory, but we also did a stage piece that was a collaboration that we started out thinking about how we could work together, and we conceived the project from the very beginning. And I think that's very different than the kind of conversational collaboration that happens with all the people that you're working with that are supporting that, as you say, Amanda, might be more of a, the role of a director. Like it depends on really the commitment and the engagement of everyone you're working with, but you, or like at the Armory, I'm still making the, you know, the big structural decisions about what happens. But there's so many gifts along the way that come from the conversations with the team, and that's so important to, you know, how a project forms.
While we have the Thoreau's desk up, Michael, let me ask you one of the questions that I had about it, since we have the opportunity here. One of the things that's really struck me about your work is your passion for American history and American literature. Mm-hmm. And it seems too that you could be very interested in almost like Americana, not in a folksy way, but rather in a way that you can celebrate the country you live in. And so I'm really interested to hear what you think about your relationship to American history and American literature, and how you mine that.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I was an American literature major in undergraduate school before I transferred to art school. So that has a lot to do with it. And when I was in high school, quite frankly, reading Henry Thoreau's Walden was the first book I read where I understood that I could make a choice about what I wanted to be, and that a person could live a life based on an idea, you know, rather than assuming that you would be. I mean, I grew up in a small town, so sort of my models were, you know, mailmen and milkmen. There were still milkmen when I grew up, things like that. And so all of a sudden there was this, you know, guy out in the woods who it wasn't clear what he did, but it wasn't a business. So that opened things up for me. It's funny, I was looking around my studio and thinking, oh, it's kind of looking like a flea market. And then I started thinking of the flea market as a kind of object archives, really. And at the moment, I'm a little bit obsessed with, I'm looking for the devil, and I'm looking for evil, because I actually think a lot of the history of America is, and there's plenty, you know, the devil's plenty visible and there's plenty evil out in the world right now. It's hardly hiding, but it's also hardly a surprise. And so among the books I'm reading right now are Henry Louis Gates' Stony the Road. And I'm reading a book called Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, which is a history of Native Americans. And I've recently been collecting some Shaker objects. And I'm really interested in sort of radical histories of America. So Thoreau would be one example. When I've been thinking about the Shakers, I'm thinking about Dan Graham's Rock My Religion. And I think he was, it's in some ways bad history if you're thinking of it historically, but it's great art and music criticism. And through Dan Graham, I'm going back to Greil Marcus. And, you know, really the history of this country is basically, you know, land grabs and murder, which is really the history of most countries. So how you balance that with also a sense of idealism and a sense of radical idealism is something that's always interested me. And so my interest in quote unquote Americana is really more interested in the objects that in some way personify certain kinds of idealism, and really comes out of, strangely enough, an equal interest in things like the Bauhaus and De Style and radical 20th century aesthetic movements that were connected to politics. And that the fact was, in American history, you know, we really didn't have an art history to some degree. You know, artists were sign painters and coopers. And that was kind of an official, semi-official doctrine because of a sort of Puritan heritage. So That's a long answer to that question, but there you go.
I like that answer. That's actually a really wonderful transition to asking Anne about the textual sources that she uses. A lot of your recent work, more recent than the event of a thread, does use text, and in really, really interesting ways, not necessarily just straightforwardly or dependent on iconography, but rather it interweaves texts in ways that I think that the viewer, reader, user of the space might find really unexpected if they were paying attention. And so I wanted to ask you about the piece that you're working on right now in Rochester, Minnesota, for which you're using a source that I think is something you've kind of turned to in the past with the library floor that you made for Ohio State's main library, but also is using new traditions as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting because both Michael and I work with words a lot in very different ways, and we always laugh when we see how much of an overlap there is. But I checked out a book from the library a number of years ago, which was a concordance of Darwin's, I think, both The Expression of Emotion in Humans and Animals. And that book, like graphically, was so fascinating to me because it organizes the text around the keywords that occur in the text. And I started using that as a way to kind of weave, not necessarily from only one text, but multiple texts, a non-linear narrative that when it is produced or printed on an architectural scale, ends up creating the experience that you actually, the act of walking across or along is also an act of composition. So the each passage is new. And so what you're seeing on the screen right now is a sample from the granite pavers that we're developing for this project for the Heart of the City, which is a public project in Rochester, Minnesota, that links the Central Mayo Clinic to the heart of downtown. And I wanted to make, what you see here too, is you see that all the letters are raised. And so they have a kind of tactile presence, as does the piece that is at the Cortlandt World Trade Center subway station in New York City. Mm-hmm. And this is very related to that. In this one, I'm weaving multiple sources of creation stories. So I was thinking about how, I initially started out thinking about time and our experience of time and scales of time, geologic, and more the hour of a day and the experience of a minute, and how we account for it, and that I was linking to institutions that also start with the first breath and end with the last one. So the passage of a life. And anyway, so, in a long roundabout process of reading, trying to figure out what to work with, I started reading these different collections of myths, but specifically creation myths that come from all different cultures. And of course, there are many common threads, but it's been an uncanny thing to be reading as the pandemic has come to surround us, because there are lots of stories when the gods are angry because the people don't behave and they don't take care of their environment, and so a flood is sent, and there's lots of flood narratives. So there are many different stories that are woven structurally by a keyword that runs down the middle of the site, but again, each passage over it is a new composition, just as each book, or really every time we read, something is reanimated in the act of our reading and engagement. So at the World Trade Center, which is there to visit if anyone ventures onto the subway, it's the #1 red line, and it's the former Cortlandt Station, now renamed World Trade Center. And there I weave phrases from the national document, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, with the international document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which forms all the horizontal lines. And so the lines repeat because of the keyword structure. And I think that makes a kind of visual refrain and chorus that repeats. I'm thinking about the people that might visit that site only once, as well as the people that might use that subway stop every single day, but every single day it changes. And that's really largely a consequence of its tactility, white on white marble, but also its scale, which meets the floor to ceiling height and runs the length of the platforms.
For our participants, Anne's project at Ohio State is called Verse. And the website that the library supported, because of course the piece is installed in the library, but also material that Anne has made available about Verse, shows you what a concordance looks like. And it can kind of give you a better sense of what Anne's talking about how she's using that concordance type to interweave these texts.
I think there's some pictures that are in the files that we sent that show that really clearly, or I can actually point my computer right here. It's on my table. See the center spine of words? There you go.
Yeah, so Emily has just shown us one too. So this is a really interesting way that particularly literary scholars followed the usage of words in texts. This is, of course, way before we have things like Google Books and other ways of finding this stuff in machine readable language. And so, first of all, there's just this way of thinking about, oh, I want to find out how many times people use the word time, but also the person who compiles this. That's an amazing thing to think about too. What the concordance does then is it gives you the context on either side of the use of the word. And I think that this is also really, really important to your work, Anne, that it's not just that you're pulling text at random or pulling passages from text at random, that you're really, really thinking about the context of the installation and the context of the text.
Yeah, completely. And also, you know, it's a very, I mean, what I love about it is it allows me to do a lot of reading and sort of sampling of things, but it's from that a whole new thing is composed. And so in some ways I'm paying a lot of attention to each line length and, you know, how it works and its rhythm. But I'm also looking, like, if you imagine walking across this, like, how the words need to have a similar rhythm so they can all stitch together. And really that goes back to the fact that I grew up weaving. And so I think the textile metaphors of crossing and of a cloth being made by this intersection of right and left and up and down, you know, that really informs how I organize a lot of the projects, even if they have no relationship to an actual textile.
It's really wonderful too that etymologically text and tissue are related, right? So this idea of cloth and text, they come from the same background for us in English, which is a really wonderful way to think about things. One more question about the Rochester, Minnesota project. You mentioned that the letters are raised as they are in others of your pieces. And one of the things that's interesting to think about in that particular community is that you're working on a public project that will be viewable and manipulable by a vulnerable population. And so I was interested in thinking about how do you make sure that it is fully accessible to the people who will be experiencing it? And also, how do you think about choosing these texts for this population who, you know, they're at Rochester, Minnesota, either because they're undergoing a health crisis or recovering from a health crisis, or their family members who are supporting them. And so I'm curious about how you think about that stuff.
Well, I think on several levels. Like, so one is that it's we're working closely with the Mayo Clinic. And so we've tested materially, like what is it like to, if you're in a wheelchair, to wheel across it, or how is it to navigate. It's actually a very, very shallow relief. It's just enough to catch the light. It seems like so far we're passing with flying colors. There's also a perimeter around the site where there are no words. So there's a completely flat pavement, which gives you access to the businesses along the side. Mm-hmm. But I think in terms of the content, initially I was really thinking about something more like the Seattle Library Project that might have multiple languages and thus address the international community that is in Rochester. And I didn't think that if I did that, it would experientially work to walk across it, because you wouldn't be able to kind of compose a story of your own. And so when I started working with the creation myths, there's a wonderful collection by David Lemming of creation myths that ended up to really help me tremendously with the research. And so the stories that are in here, really come from all over the world. And there's a large Hmong population in Rochester. And so we've tried in composing this to draw on some of the source material. But of course, a lot of origin stories, they're oral. So for a lot of cultures, there is very little available that's been transcribed into a printed version. What I'm hoping is that we're going to have a collection of the books in the public library and in the Mayo Clinic reading rooms. And we're beginning to talk about the kind of programming that will actually animate this in the community over time.
That's really, really wonderful. I want to pause here, and I know that you may have to leave. What is your schedule looking like?
I don't have to be anywhere till 2:30.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Then we'll keep going.
Yeah.
So one of the other more recent projects that you've worked on is this book that you mentioned. And I'm kind of curious to ask you as well about how you feel about the relationship between your text-based pieces and your photographic practice. I was first introduced to your work as you as a photographer, interestingly. And so I'm really curious about your constant return to the photographic.
Emily, maybe we could put on the video, one every one. It would be just to run that in the background. Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, it's interesting because photography, or the condition for making a photograph and its materiality, have been in the work from the very beginning, but it's never been, as you say, like really forward. And just as when I make an installation, I'm thinking about what is the condition here and how do I respond to that? I think the way I've approached working photographically is to think about the condition of the camera. So really early on, it was, well, what happens when your mouth becomes the shutter and the orifice of speech becomes the orifice of sight? And then the photograph is really a consequence of that process. It's not like you go out to make a picture. And in the book that you're seeing now, flash forward, 20 some years, is also the consequence of a very particular material condition. So there's a semi-translucent membrane that's like a rubber plastic that I have from a project with Bare Material Sciences. And it's made for something completely different, but I was really struck when I touched it, how it makes only what touches it in focus when the camera's on the other side. And that when I started to photograph people behind it, it makes this funny thing where you can't see through it. So you're hidden and you're maybe listening to the voice, which is my voice, to direct you. And so I think this membrane removes the camera, even though you know it's there. And I think the images that are a consequence of the interaction are different because of that material circumstance.
Mhm.
And so with the book you're seeing is when we set up, it's a newsprint book. It's made several, I don't know, I think we printed 6,000 copies to be given away. It's connected to a similar one we made for the Dell Medical Center in Austin. And it's in that case, it's like the mobile version of a permanent project. So there's two different forms for the photographs. One is this newsprint giveaway, pass hand to hand. This video actually has sound if you play it on your own, which is a house recording by Bill Frisell. And, you know, so for me, the piece is not the images, it's also the book and how the book circulates, and then how those go out in the world. And those are all tied up. So I think that I have a lot of questions about how an image becomes a tactile thing.
Mm-hmm.
And those really kind of drive the work.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you one more question about your process and your work, and then we'll move on. I want to talk a little bit about your installation work, which is something that is what I teach when I teach students about your work, and it's something that I've always been struck by. One thing that I've always really thought about in your work and that I've taught about your work is that there seems to be a chosen detail that is unexpected, but almost acts as like a keystone that somehow like holds the aesthetic intention. And so you mentioned before, like reading to pigeons, right? And so this wonderful way that, you know, people are paying attention to the swings and the veils that are affiliated with the swings and event of a thread, but also there is someone almost acting as like an aesthetic Saint Francis in the space who's educating and responding to birds, which I think is really wonderful. Others of your installations that I really think about a lot, the pennies smothered in honey in 1989's Privation and Excesses, which to me is the quintessential Anne Hamilton gesture, or the really, really brilliant coloring of the male peacocks against the orange silk in Mattering, which was from 97, 98. So I was hoping you could discuss a little bit this moment of realization when you feel that you know what you need for a work.
Oh, I think the biggest challenge for all of us, Michael, you probably, this is a conversation we have, is like, how do you trust yourself when you're in the middle of a work and you don't know, for the most part, you don't know where it's going. And then there's that moment of recognition where you're like, well, I know this much and I'm going to trust the process to take the next step, because every project is made from, you know, hundreds of little tiny decisions that grow into a work. I think that so many of the projects, they really come from being in the space, you know, and trying to be blank and say like, what is here? Because all the work is really made in response to a condition that's there. And like in the case with the sheep, it was a garage in the Mission District at a particular moment in San Francisco's history. And I can just remember walking the streets and, you know, being constantly asked for money. And, you know, that one day where someone in need is standing in front of me and all I have is pennies in my hand. And so I reach out to give the pennies and it's like, feels like this pittance, right? And really this piece grew from that interaction and thinking about the inconsequence of and perhaps the significance of this gesture of giving and the penny. And so the budget for the project became its material. So $8,000 was the project budget. It was at the Cap Street project in the Mission District. And the copper, which is a consequence of a human economy, then is laid into the product of an animal economy, the honey. And you know, I'm thinking about the relationship between those economies. And so then 3 sheep lived in the space with it and looked out across the copper to the outside. The garage door was open. This is looking towards the interior. And, you know, and it's, I think it's always asking, what is needed here? What does the project need? What is the question that I need to ask? What does the situation ask for? And the making is really the response to trying to feel or understand that need.
I think that's really, really beautiful. The pennies and honey, oh, it's one of my favorite moments. I loved introducing that to students and suggesting that there is this huge amount of money that could be expended, and it's in unspendable quantities of pennies. It makes me happy.
I mean, the other thing just to say is that probably it's one of the cleanest projects in a sense I've ever done, sticky but clean, in that you know, we washed the money afterwards. It was reconstituted. It was counted. You know, so it went to help support a project with for the arts in the local public school. And you know, the sheep went back to the ranch, and the hay they lived on went to the compost pile, and you know, there was kind of hardly anything left. And you know, not all projects have been obviously so clean, but the ecology, I suppose, or the system of this one is something that I still aspire to.
I love that. I love that. Looking at this image of the sheep, it makes me feel that I have to ask Michael then about animal husbandry.
Okay.
So Michael, you have such a diverse studio practice. Obviously, it encompasses sculpture, as we've already seen. It includes performance, text-based works, choreography, just composition, crop raising, animal husbandry. And so I want to ask you about your most recent studio practice that you mentioned to me yesterday, which is drawing, which I am fascinated by. And you know, what prompted your turn to drawing, and what do you feel is necessary right now about draftsmanship for you?
Oh, okay, great. Those are good questions. I mean, it's funny. I used to do a lot of drawing, actually before I started teaching.
Maybe put some of the images up, because I think it's really, Emily, can you put a few of those images up? I think the word drawings. Yeah, great.
There you go.
Yeah, maybe start with thing. Is the word thing in there? Because that was my first drawing, actually. Or my first recent drawing. It is funny. It's interesting to talk about this after having just watched. And there's another thing that's a black and white, which is, this is my most recent, actually, just a day or so ago. And then I have an earlier one from several months ago. But a couple of, I mean, Anne mentioned that, you know, we go back and forth. We use text a lot. And so when I used to draw, oddly enough, it was with pastels. And I used to think of drawing as something between thinking and building, because I used a lot of wood at that time. And the drawings were independent. I wasn't drawing what I was building, but it was a kind of mode of thinking through my fingers. And I'm not quite sure why pastel was my medium then, but I somehow liked the fact that it can make a sort of field or a block of color. And so recently, just before, actually, maybe 6 months ago or 8 months ago, as I got assigned a lot of committee work, actually, at the university. That's how it happened. I'm trying to remember what prompted this return to drawing. And I was trying to think of
meetings prompted it.
You know, what can I do in my studio that I can get there and get to work and not have to, you know, start up some infrastructural process, and it's just there and handy at any time. on my desk. So I started drawing again. What I was looking at though, and it's funny, as we were looking at Anne's images, this is a very kind of private, almost monastic process for me. Whereas you can see with Anne's, text works, oftentimes they're a field. And I feel like my emphasis is more that each word is a singular thing made of singular letters, which are singular shapes. And I'm as interested in the shapes of the letters they work together. So if I was going to use a musical analogy, I listen to a lot of jazz, and I think of these drawings as intimate and almost like a trio or a quartet. And so whereas Anne's work with text is often kind of oceanic and symphonic, and it just envelopes you, this is much more singular and one-on-one. And among my sources is actually thinking about these, and maybe we can show a couple others while I'm talking about them, is so people get a sense of shapes. Here's a good one. I think a lot of Bill Traylor, as an artist for whom shape and movement is really important. And the blue in this particular one was in specific response to an exhibition. I saw Bill Traylor's work, maybe 6 or 9 months ago in a gallery in New York. And I've also
David Werner.
Yeah, at David's Werner. And I've also been thinking, strangely enough, of Roger van der Weyden, who is another artist where a kind of shallow space and these shapes, these very odd shapes of bodies moving across the canvas have really struck me. And again, I guess the peculiarity of that. And then of course, so each letter is in a 9-inch by 12-inch rectangle, sitting in the middle. So the words are not kerned. And so that tends to emphasize the shape a little bit more, and they tend to be like an arm's length. So they have a kind of human dimension too. They're much larger than a book. And so they're very much about that one-on-one kind of singular thing. And they're, well, I'm thinking, we started talking about virtual space. And one thing I thought about when you asked about what the student critiques were like that we had in the spring. And this is one thing many of our students are working from their desks, working in their childhood bedrooms or down in the basement. And it's really made me think about whether one of the things that's going to evolve out of this particular period is work again that is emphasizes immediacy and emphasizes the hand, and to some degree emphasizes, and I want to be careful, but a kind of craftness, a kind of like using what's at hand and producing from that. Whereas I feel like the model of work in of successful artwork for the last 20 years has been more and more and more toward production. You see a lot of work that is really produced. And that's not the circumstance we're living in right now. And so I think a lot of us are kind of spinning our heads around about what is near at hand and who is near at hand. I mean, just another kind of story about, I've also while Anne was talking, thinking about the public and who your audience is. And as you know, I kind of run my studio as this quasi thing I call the art market, which really exists more in my head than in reality. And my only repeat customer is a homeless person named Jody. And she's at my door. And one reason she comes to my door is because my studio is on a street corner. And I recognized that when I moved into this building, that once I was, an alley is on one side and the sidewalk and the street are right up my front door. And I am public in a way here that I was not in the larger building next door where Anne practices, which is separated from the street by a parking lot for 28 cars.
I think there's a picture of the studio, which people might like to see.
Is
Yeah,
that the?
it's one of the last things I sent. I don't know if it's.
Yeah, it's a green building.
Yeah,
There it is.
it is. Yeah, there's the art market. And so, you know, when someone knocks on the door, I open it. Now, mostly it's Jody. And it makes this moment very real, though. That's a moment that's not virtual. And it's a moment where it's a moment of danger, actually, for both of us. You know, this is a person that's really on the edge. And I gave her a mask and she never wears it. But you know, it's a human being at my door, asking who is in trouble, and I need to, and I feel like it's my obligation that if art is good for you, and this is the door she's knocked on, you know, we're in some kind of relationship together. So you know, that's my audience at the moment. And I will say one more story. She was here and said, "So do you have something for me to do?" And I thought she meant like work. And she looked at me and she said, "No, you know what I mean. Like, don't you have any extra pencils or something?" And I had a block of plastiline that I gave her so that she could go and, and of course she lost it almost immediately. So there are many kinds of audiences for the kinds of work we do.
First, just an aside, I am digging the Rogier van der Weyden reference. And since you're a great reader, you should read Amy Knight Powell's Depositions. Okay. Fabulous, fabulous book. But your mention too that that you feel an obligation to your customer and therefore to your audience at large is something that I think a lot about your work, because I think that one of your materials is your ethical stance. And I think that that is so, so, so important in your work. In the bio that you wrote for your website, but also for this Brooklyn Rail chat, you mentioned that your work explores, quote, the near, the low, and the common. And I was interested in that. How does that take an ethical stance that doesn't immediately get discounted as just an elitist gesture?
Oh, it's interesting. Well, of course, that quote is from Emerson's essay on art. And I think it's been always, I talked earlier about the evil that's everywhere apparent in American history. There's also a kind of ideal within American history that is that ideal that the common, the near, the low, and the common have value. And that value is the opposite of what is elitist. And it's a very, I think it's the complicated space in which all contemporary art actually, if it has any ethic at all, exists within. How does it become particular? How does it manifest its, as Anne would say, its attention to the world as it is? And at the same time, imagine a world as it might become. So one of, which has something to do with my interest actually in Shakers and Shaker culture, in that they truly were, they believed they were constructing a heaven on earth. And their spatial as well as their social, so their material organization, their spatial organization, and their social organization was all patterned on that ideal. Interestingly, in their ceremonies, when they were possessed, as it always is in religious possession, the question was always, who is speaking? You know, is this the voice of God, or is this the voice of Satan coming out of this mouth? Because it's in a language we don't quite comprehend. And so I feel like that's the place where every artist in a less religious, but in some metaphorical way, exists within. You know, we all have that question. And so this relationship between the absolutely familiar and very well known and the absolutely unfamiliar and possibly impossible to ever know exist in the same realm. So yeah, so this is the image up now is what the art market looks on the other side, from where it says art is good for you. And yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question about the near, the common, and the low, but that's where it is. I think it's personified in this building.
I like that very, very much. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll open it up to the participants if that's all right with both of you. Okay, Michael, as I think about your practice, again, we're talking about, you know, growing beans in the bean field and then distributing them, you know, raising sheep and somehow transporting it to campus and letting the sheep be part of campus life, thinking about wind turbines, thinking about the shakers. It also seems that learning might be a medium for you. And so I'm kind of curious about that. In addition to paint, wood, sound, do you think that education for you is a medium?
So that's great. Those drawings sure make it look like it, don't they? I think it's true. I think for me, I have always been, for me, being an artist is being a student.
I like that.
Perfect. That was perfect.
Before we turn it over, is there anything that either of you would like to speak to that I haven't been able to ask you about?
Anne, do you want to go? I would just like to say, I think this is a great thing that Brooklyn Rail is doing, actually. And I think the opportunity to be an artist and speaking now and being given a forum to talk and show our work. I'm looking forward to the questions as they come in, because I'm sure for all of us, it's what we've missed most. So just a little story is, Anne and I were on our way to New York when it closed to celebrate my birthday, which was on March 13th, when in fact, and we didn't get on the plane. We were ready, like we were at the airport, ready to get on the plane, and got a phone call from someone who works for us saying that they would not, because of their husband's or their partner's business, they couldn't be around anyone who had traveled either to or from New York or from Washington State at that time, or they would have to quarantine for 2 weeks. And we needed them to be working. And so we came home. But that was on a Wednesday, and by Friday, New York had pretty much closed down. And I've been thinking of that a lot, particularly as I've gone into MoMA's actually website to see, ironically, the Donald Judd exhibition in virtual space, and also the Dorothea Lange exhibit, which were the two exhibitions. We were going to visit MoMA on my birthday to see those. So I really appreciate this opportunity that you guys are offering us to talk and be in a room with other artists and other people who love art.
This time makes one thing after another really, really poignant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And anything more that you want to add before we turn to questions?
No, it's just thank you, Amanda and Brooklyn Rail. And, you know, Michael and I are in two buildings that are across a parking lot from each other. But it's funny because it also gives us an opportunity to maybe have a conversation we don't in person. So, you know, I think that it's just that we're all compelled right now to find forms for sharing. And so thank you for this experiment.
Thank you both for those really lovely, kind words. Also, happy belated birthday, Michael. Sorry about that timing.
Happy birthday.
And really, thanks for an incredible conversation. I think I was jotting so many notes down. Like, this artwork and this art. You guys are in conversation with so many great artworks that and artists that are, I feel, defining of our times, and it's really a treat to hear you speak. We have a bunch of great questions from the audience, and we're going to start with our intrepid publisher, Fong Gui. Fong, I guess you can unmute yourself, can't you?
Hi, Anne. Hi, Michael. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Fong.
Amazing conversation, and you both sound so relaxed that I feel being nurtured. And seriously, just the fact that you talk about Thoreau, particularly, Michael, you brought his name up, and I just realized the last 3 weeks I've been going back to old books and reread particularly his 1849 Civil Disobedience. And we know that a little bit before, in 46 or something, where he was put in jail for one night. And we don't know the fact whether his aunt paid for it or was it Emerson, but he was jailed for having refused to pay poll tax because he felt the tax was helping to fund American war, you know. So he was there, and I just realized that the reference to Cage and Thoreau was very strong, particularly in chance operation in fluxus art practice. And I realized, having spoken to my friend Sylvain Lochingier, you know, who came to New York in the early 70s with the idea wanting to introduce French theory, knowingly that Marxism or any kind of Marxist political activism have no longer been an important part of class struggle by the late 60s in France. So Sylvia brought here, came to New York, and felt terrible disillusionment too, you know, the kind of post-Frankfurt School Marxism of the American left was doing the similar thing by that point, particularly by mid-70s. So he desired, what he desired was very simple, how to materialize the more fluid, rhizomatic idea of power desire developed by his friend Guattari, Deleuze, Foucault, and whatnot. And I just felt so profoundly dutiful because I just went back and reread also John Dewey. And one of the things that you mentioned about hand, things made by hand, it's so compelling at the moment because we have all this created, you know, phrase, for example, alternative facts, you know, and we know facts in all the languages, or most of them anyway, means product of labor. And in one of the most important things that Dewey teaching was, or philosophy was, make no separation. There's no division between vocational learning and academic learning. And I think that's my question, haven't said too many things here, but can we do greater mobilization among what we do as teachers, as artists? How can we get the message even clearer to the student and how to bring them together at this forum, hopefully with the beginning of that mobilization? I mean, how do you experience that now at Ohio State? Is there hope? Young people, are they interested?
Wow, that is an enormous question. Well, you know, one of the wonderful things about being a teacher at a large campus, and I think one of the, at least hopes for me at Ohio State is it's a public land grant university. And actually Amanda mentioned earlier the Living Culture Initiative, and really what, when we started the Living Culture Initiative, what we hoped to do and were trying to do was create a condition in which contemporary art practice would directly engage the research and educational mission of the land grant university, which, and I think in my own practice, which I imagined as a renewal of what I called America's agricultural commons, and taking the word agricultural and emphasizing the cultural. And I think for me, there are two things that are connected, that are our hands are also a brain. And if our hands are also a brain, then our bodies have the capacity. And since you bring it up, you know, we have the capacity for revolution. and the body, you know, is the site of all contention. And so that's where, you know, we take our stance. And if I think of young people in particular, like I think that one of the interesting things of identity politics, quote unquote, as they play out on a day-to-day basis on our campus, is that the insistence of young people to be recognized for whoever and whatever they actually are. And they're very, very radical in that insistence sometimes, in a way that I find quite refreshing, because it makes me rethink everything. You know, whenever I'm confronted by a young person who's making me rethink everything, it's like, I find that it's like taking a bath. It's incredibly refreshing.
Wow. Thank you, Michael. And what did you think?
Oh, maybe closer to hand. The only thing that I might add is that it's so important to understand that, and I think everyone on this call, is something that everyone knows, is that this is a form of thinking. And how are we responsible to the ability that we all have to think with our hands? And in a moment where touch, or to be touched in return, is such an enormously complicated thing. So what are all the forms in which we, you know, might touch at a distance? And you know, what is, I mean, this strays very far from your question, but really, what are forms for intimacy now? Like, I think about the intimacy with complete strangers, like, you know, the way in the theater you sit, you know, 2 inches from someone you'll probably never see again, but there's something about the sense of a collective experience with complete strangers that I think, how do we connect what the nature or the quality of that experience with what we can do with this?
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you both for that response. I always love hearing how professors think about identity politics in the classroom. Very contentious topic, and I really liked your answer. Our next question is from Natalie Settles. Natalie, are you still there? I will unmute you now.
Hi, this is a question for Anne. Anne, good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, and I wanted to, it's great to have a chance to talk with you about this ephemerality, or sort of slipperiness, or sort of time passage and loss, and has been a huge part of your work over time. And one thing that really struck me on first seeing the World Trade Center work, which I'd seen in photographs and then was finally able to see myself, was how it still, that work felt so powerfully ephemeral, even as it was made of marble. And I'm not sure how long, I'll admit to, I'm not sure how long you've been working in stone. I had seen some works in concrete, but I wonder how you think about things like stone and concrete and the relationship to the ephemeral, because that's really intriguing. It had a much more powerful effect. I mean, being there and feeling that and being so struck by it. I wonder if you could talk to that a bit more.
Well, first, thank you. Nice to see you again. Thank you for using the word feeling. I mean, one of my favorite drawings of Michael's is the word feeling, because I think that, you know, we're in a moment where we are flooded with information, but if we lose the ability to respond to that with to feel that information, then it's all over, right? So you know, the thing about the marble, well, I didn't really decide to work in stone, but all the commissions for the MTA are mosaics. And we had a long conversation about, rather than this being glass, that because of the site and because of the idea that it needed to be of the ground in a different way than glass. And so that's when we were able to explore the possibility of using marble and white marble, which relates to the Calatrava space, but also obviously the Lincoln Memorial. And, you know, I think the thing is that the piece may be, you know, relatively permanent. It's sited on the walls of the subway, but in terms of the ephemerality in your questions, it's fleeting because it's really in the reading of it and the passing of it and the reaching your hand out, that when those words become tactile underneath your fingertips, that perhaps they have a different weight and they motivate a different feeling and response. While in the one hand, it's very permanent, you know, on the other hand, it's really it's carried in all the people that pass it.
And especially speaking to rights, it really struck me there, or inherent rights, and how many times we violate what should be inherent and obvious about all humankind. And so that, I think those two things interacting just really sort of floored me right there on the station. Everybody's flying by and I'm sort of having a moment. But thank you for that work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting also to work on that project, like working with the Creation Myths now for the project in Rochester, Minnesota, that I started working with these narratives and these myths, you know, obviously way before the pandemic, but the way that they have this weird alignment, which returns to Amanda's question, you know, the view is different. You're working on the same thing, but how you think about it changes. And for the World Trade Center, working with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which really is the foundation for all human rights declarations at this point, even as contested as aspects of it are, that I was working on that, you know, when Obama was still president. And so it was, and it opened a year ago fall, with like, and obviously the way we read and say and need those words in those documents shifts as everything around it is shifting. And so I think that's the way all of us in different ways, kind of consciously and unconsciously, are really working to the moment we live in. Sometimes it's not so easy to see how, but I think it's there. And I think, you know, our intuition about those things is very strong. So like in this moment when I think we're all trying to figure out how to find form to actually respond to where we are. And that may be in subject matter, it may be in form, you know, there's all different ways that we can find to make in the world. And really that's our challenge.
So true. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for that question, Natalie. I think, and I know you have to go in about 9 minutes, but I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from a Rail editor at large, Jason Rosenfeld. Jason, I'm going to unmute you now.
Okay, thank you. Anne, I have a question for you to follow up on chorus and the question that you just responded to. I'd like to ask you about illegibility. The WTC Cortland Station text is in low relief. It is often very hard to read the times that I've been there, as opposed to maybe engraved text on a wall like at the Lincoln Memorial. And I was wondering if this is kind of calculated or if it's sort of a product of the flush lighting. And I guess I think about it in the same way as I think about Jenny Holzer's AIDS memorial in the West Village with its text from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, where it's extremely difficult to read. It forces you to look at it closely, but it becomes hard to read it. And I wonder if there's a kind of gambit there in pursuing a kind of textual illegibility or asking more maybe of the reader, the viewer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gives a lot and it asks a lot, right? So, and which is all work should do. at some level. And I think that one of the things it does is when something is inscrutable at some level, I think sometimes our impulse is to reach our hand out to touch, you know, like you don't quite know, so you put your hand out to affirm for yourself something.
Yeah.
And I think it's in that gesture that like the legibility and illegibility work in that particular project. You know, some people get off the subway, they don't even look at the wall, right? So they're not even trying to read it. And some people linger for, you know, a very long time. I think that there's reading, and then there's actually really feeling the weight of the words you're reading. And the form of it is for the latter.
Yeah, that's a great response. Thank you for that. I always tell my students, if it's outside or in public, touch it. If it's sculpture, you can't do it in the museum, but there's a haptic quality of it to it, which is really important. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that just as follow-ups are like, it's hard to see on the screen, but one of the things that, because Michael and I are, you know, obviously we're married, we live together, we deal with the flooded basement together and all those things, but like the word drawings have that same tactility, even as they're like objects. So it's interesting, like how, you know, like from really different forms, like we almost get to the same experience.
Yeah, and I would just end up saying, you know, as you're talking about that, I was thinking about how my use of words is, you know, they're singular, but their meaning is utterly unspecified. And purposely so. And so kind of coming at a similar ambiguity from opposite ends of the spectrum.
So interesting.
Thank you both. I think that's a perfect place to switch to the poem, if that's okay with everybody. And our tech wizard, Emily Dean, is going to be reading for us today.
Great.
Hey, thank you so much all for talking today. That was a super interesting conversation. The poem that I'm reading is by Tracy K. Smith, called Now That the Weather Has Turned. Ice cakes the ground. We break into something with every careful step. Nothing disappears, only hovers and thins. Whoever we were months ago is colder. Someone writes to say I bear down upon him like a wet coat, just those lines. Once I wanted everything to come to me at once, a house converged upon by headlights, a door muscled open by strangers, distant cousins, uniforms, and stenciled badges. When they came, I let them in, gesturing toward the comfortable chair, crisp sheets. Now I finger the smooth objects forgotten by I don't know whom. They tremble like eggs in a shallow drawer.
Nice, thank you, Emily. Love the touching line, thinking about going and touching the walls of that subway station as soon as I can, wearing gloves, of course. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you so much to Anne and Michael and Amanda for today's conversation. Please join us tomorrow for our next new social environment with our guest critic, Daisy Desrosiers, artists Jesse Chun and Asa El Siddiq, hosted by our dear friend Yassi Alipour, with a celeb guest poetry reader, our poetry editor, Anselm Berrigan. Should bring you that fully. I'm going to allow everybody to unmute themselves if they'd like to say goodbye on their way out. Thank you very much, all.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne and Michael.
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thanks, JC and Fong.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Anna, Michael,
Thank you.
Amanda.
Thank you all.
I love seeing everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Great. Hi, JT. Hi, Jock. Robert.
Hey, Rachel.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, bye, Anne. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, Anne.
Much
Bye,
love.
Amanda.
Bye, Michael. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Amanda.
Hi, Lynn.
Bye, Michael.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Hi, Fong. Good to see you.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. Good to see you.
See you Thursday.
Okay.
At Independence Salon. Bye.
Yeah, see you Thursday. Come sing with us.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. Philip. Hi, Natalie. You all have a good day.